Most people who find good, simple living for the first time spend about 10 minutes watching before they start wondering how any of it is real. The house is enormous, a barndominium-style structure on 20 acres of North Idaho mountain land, hand-built almost entirely by a couple with no professional construction background. There are 5 kids, there are horses, there's a podcast, a book deal, and a channel pushing toward 540,000 subscribers. It looks like the life everybody says they want when they're stuck in traffic on the way to a job they tolerate. But here's the part of the story that tends to get glossed over in the highlight reels. Before any of that existed, Jeremy Souza was a cop, not a weekend hobbyist, not a guy dabbling with self-sufficiency on the side. A full-career law enforcement officer with over a decade on the job, a pension on the horizon, a mortgage, car payments, and a family of 6 depending on a paycheck that arrived every 2 weeks without fail. What he decided to do in April of 2020, during one of the most unstable moments in modern American history, was throw all of that away on purpose. And the wild part is, it worked. But not for the reasons most people assume. Jeremy Souza grew up in Hawaii. That detail matters more than it might seem, because the man who eventually built a mountain homestead in Idaho by hand started his adult life about as far from that as you can get. He moved to Washington State, got into law enforcement, and spent 12 years working as a police officer. Melissa, née Monroe, had her own career running in parallel. She studied early childhood education in North Dakota, taught in the public school system in both Nevada and Washington, and eventually stepped back from the classroom to raise their 4 children full-time. The two married in 2008, and by the mid-2010s, they were doing what most families in their situation do, working, paying down a mortgage on a suburban home in Battleground, Washington, and quietly wondering if there was a different version of their lives they weren't living. The homestead idea didn't come out of nowhere. As far back as 2016, Jeremy and Melissa were already working a 1-acre plot, raising meat rabbits, growing food, seed saving, canning. It was a side pursuit on top of everything else, but it was deliberate. They weren't playing at sustainability, they were learning it one skill at a time. Their first YouTube video went up on February 27, 2016. It was called Jack and Jessica Rabbit, literally footage of their breeding rabbits. The audience was tiny. Nobody was calling it a media business. It was documentation, pure and simple, a record of what they were figuring out. But something about putting it on camera changed the calculus. And within a few years, the 1-acre plot and the suburban house started to feel like the wrong size for what they were trying to do. By 2020, Jeremy and Melissa had been working toward a goal that sounds simple on paper and is brutally hard in practice: become debt-free before 40. They'd spent years living frugally, paying down what they owed, and building up the savings to make a move. The Washington house was worth roughly $600,000. They sold it. Then they bought 20 raw acres in Bonners Ferry in northern Idaho and moved the family into a Jayco trailer that cost less than $10,000. They towed that trailer with a Jeep Liberty. If you know anything about towing, you already know the Jeep Liberty was not built for that job. It struggled uphill. It overheated. Jeremy would later upgrade to a heavy-duty Chevy truck, but in those first months, they were navigating mountain terrain in a vehicle that was genuinely not up to the task. The timing of all of this was April 2020. The world was in the middle of a complete shutdown. Melissa was homeschooling 4 kids, Kaimani, Nevi, Kira, and Eli, inside a trailer on a plot of land that had no house, no barn, no utilities running to it, and no guarantee that any of it would work out. Jeremy's police career was over. The paycheck was gone. The plan was to build a home from scratch, on camera, with their own hands. People in their position don't usually do this. They think about it. They pin images to a board. They watch other people's channels about it. Jeremy and Melissa actually did it in the worst possible moment, with the least possible margin for error. That combination of timing and commitment is a large part of why people kept watching. The move to Idaho wasn't random, and it wasn't just about the scenery. Jeremy and Melissa had done their research, and northern Idaho checked boxes that Washington state couldn't. Rural land in northern Idaho, particularly in counties like Boundary County where Bonners Ferry sits, operates under some of the most permissive land use regulations in the country. Building codes in unincorporated areas are handled at the county level, and in rural northern Idaho, the rules around owner-built construction are significantly more flexible than in most other states. No mandatory inspection schedules dragging out a build. No layers of municipal bureaucracy deciding whether you're allowed to live in a structure you built with your own hands while you're still building it. For a couple whose entire plan depended on keeping costs down and moving fast, Idaho wasn't just a pretty backdrop, it was a strategic decision. They also had no HOA, no covenants dictating what they could build or how, no neighbors close enough to complain. The low population density of Boundary County, the mountain terrain, the weather, all of it aligned with what they were looking for. Jeremy has talked about it directly in their content. They wanted to be genuinely isolated. Not aesthetically isolated like a lot of homesteading channels, actually away from things. That isolation, combined with the cost structure that Idaho made possible, is what allowed the build to happen at all. Here is what the Good Simple Living highlight reels tend to skip over. For more than 2 years, the Souza family did not have a working toilet. They used a composting system. Jeremy has talked about this on camera in a way that's both honest and deeply uncomfortable, describing how he had to carry waste buckets from the composting toilet out to the garden on a regular schedule. He called it summoning the courage each time. That's a diplomatic way to describe a task that most people couldn't do once before reconsidering their entire life plan. Melissa was homeschooling 4 kids inside a trailer while Jeremy was outside building. The weather in northern Idaho is not mild. Winters are real winters. The trailer was not insulated for that. There were mornings where the situation was simply hard in ways that don't translate well into content. And yet they kept filming. Not the polished version of it, the actual version. Mistakes in the framing, wrong lumber orders, physical exhaustion on camera. That's the detail that built the audience. Viewers who found the channel during the build era weren't watching a fantasy. They were watching real people in real difficulty making real decisions in real time. There's a ceiling on how long you can fake that kind of authenticity. And Jeremy and Melissa never had to fake it because they weren't living a fake version. The channel's subscriber count climbed steadily throughout the build period. Not because the content was produced well, it wasn't always, but because the content was true. The structure Jeremy built is not a modest cabin. It's a barndominium-style pole barn design, a building concept that combines large open workshop or garage space with full living quarters, and does it under one roof. The appeal for an owner-builder is that you're starting with a structure that's inherently strong, doesn't require the same foundation complexity as a stick-frame home, and goes up faster than most traditional builds. Jeremy had no professional construction background. He learned as he went, researching, making mistakes, correcting them. Melissa was part of the build process throughout, not just managing the household, but actively involved in the decisions and the physical work. Outside contractors were brought in for specific trades, the parts where you genuinely need licensed work done. But the bulk of what you see in the finished house came from Jeremy and Melissa's own labor. The exterior and interior were both completed in late December 2022. They marked the moment with a celebration and the detail that Jeremy had been holding out for, the thing that represented the finish line to him more than anything else, was the installation of a lodge-style wood stove in the living room. After 2+ years of a composting toilet and a trailer for a bedroom, that stove going in was the moment the house felt like a home. The property now includes the main house, a substantial addition, 2 barns, a shed, fencing, a large garden, and a chicken coop. The horses came later. Melissa had ridden competitively in her youth and sold her horses before college. When 2 horses, Coda and Lexon, came to the homestead in September 2021, it completed something for her personally. Coda was eventually sold due to behavioral issues in July 2023, and an older, calmer horse named Little Debbie joined the property. A 64 by 40-foot barn was built in August of that year to give Little Debbie proper shelter, outside the original plan. But Melissa made the call, and it happened. By the time the house was done, Good Simple Living had crossed the 500,000 subscriber mark and accumulated over 130 million total views. That's not a homesteading niche number, that's a mainstream audience. What drove it wasn't production quality. Early videos are rough, framing is inconsistent, audio isn't always clean, edits are basic. What drove it was the same thing that drives almost every channel that breaks out in an underserved niche. The subject matter was real, and nobody else was covering it the same way. A lot of homesteading content on YouTube is aspirational in a way that feels slightly dishonest. Channels that show the harvest, but skip the crop failure, the beautiful kitchen, but not the month when the well pump broke and nobody could afford to fix it. Good Simple Living was different because it was filmed in the moment, not in retrospect, with the comfortable distance of knowing how it all turned out. The daughter Neve caught the same impulse. She launched her own YouTube channel at Souza and has built close to 60,000 subscribers independently, documenting homestead life from her own perspective. That's not a footnote. That's a kid who grew up watching her parents build something and decided to build something of her own. In May 2024, a video appeared on the channel with a title that stood apart from the usual build content. Things have changed. We're going back to make it right. It wasn't a crisis video. There was no blow-up, no controversy, no announcement that the channel was ending. But it was a public acknowledgement that something about how they were operating, either on camera or in their lives or both, had drifted from where they started. The video represented a conscious decision to recalibrate rather than drift further. Around the same period, the operation around Good Simple Living quietly expanded in ways that weren't necessarily obvious to casual viewers. Melissa's role evolved significantly. She became the host of a podcast called New World Old Soul, which drew enough attention to get Jeremy and Melissa invited onto other shows, including a 2024 episode of The Eric Allen Show, where they talked candidly about faith, the homestead journey, and the Childhood Cancer Coalition fundraising work they'd been doing for 5 consecutive years in partnership with families across North Idaho, eastern Washington, and western Montana. That charity work is another part of the story that doesn't get talked about much. The Childhood Cancer Coalition operates without federal funding, and the Souzas have used their platform to raise money for it annually, 5 years running. That's a commitment that predates most of the channel's growth and continues regardless of where the numbers are. Melissa has also been writing, contributing to Self-Reliance magazine, and working on a book. Her Instagram bio lists her as an author. The channel that started as rabbit footage in 2016 had by 2024 become the anchor of a multi-platform media operation with a podcast, a writing career, and a growing community built around something more substantial than views. The channel description changed too. It now says, Family of 7. There are 5 children in the Souza household. That 5th child arrived quietly, without a major announcement, the kind of life update that appears in a description line before it makes it into a dedicated video. As of early 2026, Good Simple Living is still uploading. The channel hasn't gone quiet. The homestead in Bonners Ferry is still the base of everything. The most recent content tease on Facebook referenced something big they'd been keeping from their audience, the kind of reveal that their community shows up for because 6 years of unfiltered content has earned them that kind of trust. The numbers are real. The combined estimated net worth, homestead property, equipment, vehicles, the LLC registered in Idaho in December 2020, the online operation, sits around $3 million according to 2025 estimates. Monthly channel revenue is estimated somewhere between $15,000 and $30,000, with sponsorships, the podcast, and Melissa's writing adding to that total. That's not nothing for a family that was carrying buckets across a field at 2 in the morning in 2021. Jeremy and Melissa have been married since 2008. They built a company, a home, a community, and a media brand together with 5 kids along for every step of it. Good Simple Living LLC is formally registered in Idaho. There are business inquiries going to a dedicated email. This is not a hobby channel run by people figuring it out. It's a professional operation that grew out of what looked, from the outside, like an incredibly risky personal decision. The debt-free goal they announced when they were still in Washington? The one that seemed overly ambitious to anyone looking at the numbers they started with? They got there. And then they built something worth a lot more than the house they sold to fund it. There's an irony at the center of the Good Simple Living story that doesn't get said out loud enough. Jeremy and Melissa left a stable, predictable, fully paid-for version of their lives in April 2020, right at the moment when stability felt like the only rational thing to hold on to. They sold the house, they quit the job, they moved 4 children into a trailer on a piece of raw Idaho land with a camera pointed at it, and decided that whatever happened next was going to happen in public. The result wasn't simple. It was one of the more complicated things a family can attempt. 2 years of composting toilets, a Jeep that wasn't built for the mountains, a build that took longer and cost more than the plan said it would, and a relationship and a marriage and a household that had to stay intact through all of it. What they ended up with, the house, the channel, the podcast, the horses, the 5 kids, the community, is the product of something that had nothing to do with content strategy or audience metrics. It came from the fact that they were genuinely doing what they said they were doing. The camera was on because they wanted a record of it, not because they were trying to perform it. That difference is the whole story, and it's the reason, 6 years later, people are still watching.